The UK government's economic policy is crazy, incompetent. So is the government actually incompetent? Or are they lying when they boldly announce that their plans are working? Let's take a look at that question. The UK is an amazing country, I think. I have no interest in putting it down. But let's review some facts. Disappointing economic growth, high debt, failing public services, crumbling infrastructure, and massive poverty and inequality. So what is the government's economic plan to deal with this mess? The plan is basically to grow the economy. Economic growth would result in more tax being received by the government, which would allow the debt to be reduced and allow increased spending on public services. In the meantime, the idea is to be responsible with spending. Given the large current debt, this means reducing public spending. So the government is basing their economic policy on the idea that in order to increase tax revenue and spending on public services, you need to decrease tax and decrease spending on public services. We've now had decades of experience of neoliberal economic ideologies. We know that reducing taxes is not an effective way of stimulating growth. However, in the past few days, Jeremy Hunt has published an article on the website Conservative Home. In it, he says the following: I recently asked my Treasury officials to do a detailed analysis of the correlation between taxes and growth, and the answer came back clearly. Lower taxed economies have seen higher growth, and higher taxed economies have seen lower growth. It's why we've brought taxes down. It's the only path to a sustainably higher growth economy. I'm not able to find any reference to this analysis that he mentions, so it must be internal work done within the Treasury. However, what I did find was a Bloomberg report, also from the last few days, claiming the opposite. It claims that internal analysis was given to the new team coming after the trust debacle in 2022. The analysis is reported to have told Sunak and Hunt that tax cuts would have a low impact on boosting growth. This shouldn't have been a surprise. There is other hard evidence in the public domain that this is the case. A report published by the LSE in 2020, based on a detailed analysis of data from 18 OECD countries, made this unambiguous conclusion. We find that major reforms reducing taxes on the rich lead to higher income inequality. In other words, reducing taxes makes the rich richer. In contrast, the report goes on to conclude that such reforms do not have any significant effect on economic growth. In other words, tax cuts are not a strong stimulant for economic growth. More evidence comes from a major US study published by the Congressional Research Service in 2012, which stated there is not conclusive evidence to substantiate a clear relationship between the 65-year steady reduction in the top tax rates and economic growth. The study goes on to say that the top tax rate reductions appear to be associated with the increasing concentration of income at the top of the income distribution. In other words, it confirms exactly what the LSE research says. So why is Jeremy Hunt saying the exact opposite of this? There are only two possible explanations. Either he is completely incompetent and has no idea of what he's doing, or he's lying and this is all about making the rich richer. There is clear evidence that tax cuts increase the wealth of the rich. Surely he knows this. I'll leave you to make up your own mind on this. But bear in mind, you'd also have to say that Sunak is incompetent, that Liz Truss was incompetent, that Cameron and Osborne were incompetent, etc., etc., because they all subscribe to the same policies. These question marks over the government's economic policy continue. The Institute for Fiscal Studies has recently published a new report on the trade-offs that the new government will have to make after the election later this year. It states that when the public finances are so constrained, bear in mind that the UK debt is currently 100% of GDP, tax cuts today add to the risk of tax rises or spending cuts tomorrow. It might be easy to announce immediate tax cuts, without any hint of what it is the state currently does that it will stop doing, or what taxes will rise in future. But this trade-off cannot be wished away. The incompetence of this is not subtle, it's in plain sight. The debt is so bad that there's a simple trade-off. In order to meet the government debt reduction targets, there'll have to be either income tax increases or spending cuts. Therefore, the equation is simple. If the government is decreasing tax, it'll also have to find more spending cuts. Yet the government isn't being honest about this. This lack of transparency and honesty was highlighted this week by the chair of the Office for Budget Responsibility, the government's official watchdog. He was giving evidence on the country's finances to the Lord's Economic Affairs Committee. He accused the government's forecast of a debt reduction in 2028 as being a work of fiction. He described what the OBR has actually been provided with by the government. The government did a spending review setting out detailed departmental spending plans for the year up until March 2025. Beyond that, we know virtually nothing. So the government is saying that it'll reduce the debt by 2028, but it hasn't given any detail on how it intends to do it. He continues, it's just two numbers, one for total current spending and one for total capital spending done by departments. I think some people have referred to that as a work of fiction. I think that's probably generous given that someone's bothered to write a work of fiction, whereas the government hasn't even bothered to write down what departmental spending plans are underpinning the plans for public services. Ouch. That's harsh. This isn't a politician, this isn't a press article, this isn't even an academic study. Although the OBR works at arm's length, it's a government body. This is the head of an important part of our governmental institutions, saying that it's generous to call the government's economic plans a work of fiction. And he's not doing that with any agenda. What he's saying is absolutely true, and it's his job to say it even if the government doesn't like it. So where does that leave us? Public services and infrastructure are in crisis and need more spending. Fact. The government believe that tax cuts will create growth which will allow increased spending, but the evidence shows this won't work. Fact. But the rich will become richer. Fact. The government must either increase taxes or reduce spending. Fact. If it's decreasing taxes, it will have to cut spending even more. Fact. The government's economic policy will not bring economic growth. It will not reduce debt. So it'll mean that public services will get even worse. So how can this government be so brazen and cocky about its policies? As I say, either incompetent or lying to protect the rich. You decide. I hope you found this information useful. If you did, please consider liking and subscribing. I'd be really grateful for that. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.